And to finish off our opening ceremony, I would like to invite Dr. Marcus Noland for a special keynote speech. As you know, Dr. Noland is Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Dr. Noland has also previously served as Senior Economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors and is currently a Senior Fellow at the East-West Center. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marcus Noland with a round of applause.
Good morning. It's a great honor to address this esteemed audience this morning. IGE founder Dr. Zhigang Il played an important role in bringing me to South Korea early in my career, and I've enjoyed a fruitful relationship with IGE since its founding. I was also the beneficiary of a POSCO fellowship at the East-West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii, which eventually led to a 15-year affiliation with that institution. POSCO subsequently became a corporate supporter of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, my home institution, and we even placed one of our analysts, Kim Ji-sun, who is over there somewhere, at POSRI. There she is. I've had a long-standing productive relationships with both IGE and POSCO. That said, as an American, it is with a certain degree of trepidation that I approach these remarks this morning. In terms of Henry Fernandez's three big trends, I will focus on the economic policy and geopolitical disruptions and leave AI to subsequent speakers. I'll make three broad points. First, for 80 years, the U.S. led an open, liberal, rules-based international order. The results were not perfect, but they created conditions under which South Korea prospered and eventually democratized. Under the second Trump administration, the U.S. has broken with the principles and practices of the last 80 years in the economic sphere, and it may abandon traditional alliance relations in the security sphere as well. Second, South Koreans are right to be nervous about these developments. And third, the extent to which the United States will return in a post-Trump political environment to its earlier principles and practices and resume a leadership role in the global system is an open question, and I am skeptical. So in the remainder of my time, I will address the implications for South Korea of U.S. trade policy, the recent so-called investment deals, the Iran war, and discuss related issues in passing. Trade policy in the second Trump administration is characterized by increased complexity, instability, and uncertainty. For most of the history of the United States, tariff rates varied by products, but not by country. There was a single rate applied to all partners. After the Second World War, the U.S. adopted the most favored nation principle and distinguished between two groups of countries. The vast majority of countries got relatively low, what we call column 1 tariffs, and a handful of countries such as Cuba and North Korea got the much higher old Smoot-Hawley column 2 tariffs, the ones that are, this is strange, my slide advanced, but this slide did not advance. Okay, so I'm seeing something different on my screen than what's showing up here. So somebody from this conference needs to come fix this.
Great.
For most of the history of the Republic, we had one tariff rate applied to all countries. After the Second World War, we adopted most favored nation. We had two rates, a low rate for most everyone and a high rate for a handful of communist countries. That high rate is that big spike that you see over in the 1930s, okay? On so-called Liberation Day, Donald Trump introduced 57 country-specific tariff rates, and these were not only more complicated, but on average they are higher, and that is the spike you see at the very end of the chart. Trump tried to justify the Liberation Day tariffs under something called the International Economic Emergencies Power Act, or what we say in the vernacular IEPA, but the Supreme Court ruled that the use of IEPA for this purpose was unconstitutional. So the Trump administration, as we speak, is trying to reconstruct the so-called Liberation Day tariffs by using other authorities in the 1974 Trade Act. And so far, he has changed tariff rates more than 50 times. Okay, next slide. Okay. So, Trump campaigned on three policies: trade protection, mass deportations, and expressed interest in bringing the Fed to heel. Our modeling work indicates that the tariffs had a predictably negative impact on South Korea and the United States. The right-hand side of the panel is a chart from one of the papers I wrote with my colleague Warwick McKibben. It is from September. And I'm not going to go into detail on our work because the administration has changed tariff rates so many times that we stopped trying to keep up with it all. And we're just going to wait until things settle down later this year, and then we'll rerun the model. In the interest of time, I will not discuss mass deportations in any great detail, other to say that the administration has effectively ended both legal and illegal immigration into the United States, which is a big shock to the labor force. Our labor force is now about 2 million workers less than what the Congressional Budget Office projected about 18 months ago. From the standpoint of South Korea, there are two effects. The negative impact on the U.S. economy means reduced demand for South Korean exports to the United States. But the slowdown in the U.S. economy also means that, a reduction of investment in the United States. And capital that would have been invested in the United States goes to peer economies, including South Korea. And it turns out these two channels, the direct trade effect and the capital market effect, cancel each other out. There's almost no net effect on South Korea. So the policy has a big effect on the U.S., basically no effect on South Korea. The third policy concern is the erosion of the independence of the Fed, and indeed, we're having hearings right now about Trump's nominee to be the new chair. If Trump succeeds in pressuring the Fed to lower interest rates more than is warranted, that will create a short-run boom that will eventually dissipate into inflation and capital outflow. South Korea will be one beneficiary of that capital flight, though I'm not sure that's a world that any of us want to live in. Okay, move forward. Under the threat of the so-called reciprocal tariffs, the Trump administration was able to secure investment deals with a number of countries, including South Korea and Japan. The irony is that the reciprocal tariffs were declared unconstitutional, but the deals remain. And my lawyer colleagues tell me that Section 301 of the Trade Act is a viable enforcement mechanism. It's interesting to compare the U.S. arrangements with South Korea and Japan. The Japanese deal was reached first because of the disruption in the electoral calendar created by the impeachment of President Yoon here in South Korea. It went second and was able to learn from the Japanese experience. And it appears that South Korea may have gotten the better deal. In both cases, a binational advisory board suggests projects based on U.S. priorities to a U.S. government interagency committee chaired by the Secretary of Commerce. And in the South Korean deal, the chair of that first stage advisory committee is South Korean. The Secretary of Commerce then presents a menu of projects to the President of the United States, who makes the final decision. In both, the Japanese deal commits Japan to $550 billion in the investment in the United States over 4 years. The South Korean agreement commits South Korea to invest $350 billion, 150 of which is earmarked for shipbuilding, which actually may be a worthwhile thing to do. Over a 10-year period, with investments outside of shipbuilding capped at $20 billion a year. So Japan has a greater burden, but it also has more resources. It has $1.4 trillion in official reserves. and is generally assessed to have more fiscal space to raise money internally. South Korea has only $400 billion in official reserves and less room to raise funds domestically. But the 10-year time horizon on the South Korean agreement embodies the possibility that a future U.S. administration might absolve South Korea from this obligation. So, next slide. Comparative burden. South Korea, for Japan, the transfers amount to about 3% of GDP annually. The comparative figure for South Korea is lower, about 1.5% to 2%. This situation, and here, this is the risk of inviting a PhD in economics to give a talk. So here's the obligatory economics nerd section of the talk. This situation evokes the so-called transfer problem, a debate between John Maynard Keynes and Bertil Ohlin in the 1920s. Keynes had been part of the British delegation to the Treaty of Versailles negotiations at the end of the First World War. He was appalled by the punitive and, in his view, unrealistic terms imposed on Germany, quit the delegation, and in 1919 wrote an impassioned monograph titled The Economic Consequences of the Peace. He argued that the transfer would impose an additional burden on Germany not recognized in the financial calculations. In order to generate the funds to repay the victors, Germany would have to run an additional trade surplus, which in turn would require a reduction in Germany's terms of trade, which in today's floating rate system would manifest as a depreciation of the exchange rate. Olin argued that this additional terms of trade burden was not necessary. When the victors received the transfer, they would either increase public spending or would cut taxes, and the additional domestic demand would stimulate demand for German exports. In the intervening 100 years, the transfer problem has come up in other situations, notably Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s. Warwick McKibben and I are in the process of applying it to the current cases of Japan and South Korea, and I will simply note in passing that German reparations averaged 3% of GDP annually in the 1920s, roughly the same as what Japan is being required to invest in the US. Next slide. The payout mechanisms of these arrangements make them even more extortionate. Simplifying things a bit, revenues are split 50-50 until the donor, that is to say Japan or South Korea, gets paid back their initial investment plus interest, after which the United States gets 90%, the donor gets 10%. One difference is the South Korean agreement has the projects all being pooled together, which potentially has implications for payouts. A simple deterministic example is illustrated in this right-hand side panel. Assuming 5% rates of discount and interest in 30-year project life, a project would have to generate a 12.5% return for the donor to achieve a positive present discounted value. We are currently exploring the implications of stochastic returns across projects and intend to plug these results into the macroeconomic model to see if we do get the exchange rate depreciation implied by Keynes. The irony, of course, is that by potentially encouraging exchange rate depreciation by South Korea and Japan, the Trump administration risks worsening the bilateral trade balances with which it is obsessed. Next slide. Finally, the U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran has roiled energy markets. We are currently modeling an illustrative chart is on the right-hand side, and in this case shows a severe, persistent shock to oil prices scenario. And I should note that, and this is very important, McKibben's participation in this effort is supported by a grant from the Ministry of Education and the National Research Foundation of Korea. He was very insistent that I read that. Korea is relatively intensively affected by the high energy prices, but you didn't need me to tell you that. And then the energy prices cascade down the supply chain, affecting things like production of fertilizer, production of semiconductors, and so on. The need to defend the Gulf states attacked by Iran has required redeployment of defense systems away from South Korea. And the increases in oil prices and partial relaxation of sanctions has benefited Russia and, by extension, North Korea. Trump's disparagement of U.S. allies has called into question the concept of extended deterrence, and that raises difficult questions for South Korea. Next slide. So where do we go from here? Suppose the Democrats take power in the United States in 2028. They are instinctively multilateralist, but protection once imposed is difficult to remove. Just look at the experience of the Biden administration, which retained most of the protection on China imposed by the first Trump administration, and then added their own twist in the form of export controls. The WTO is in disarray, and USTR Jameson's Greer disparagement of the recent Yaoundé ministerial could even be taken as a signal of a willingness to leave the organization. It is possible that the locus of trade policy making would shift to Asia, especially if the EU and the CPTPP were to engage in substantive talks. So where does that leave the United States? How will the rest of the world respond to even a well-meaning successor administration? Credibility is easily lost and difficult to regain. What does it mean for the centrality of the dollar in the international financial system? The technological advances that will be discussed subsequently in this conference could make maintaining a diversified portfolio less costly and contribute to further erosion of the dollar's primacy. If the unraveling continues in the security sphere, the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence will be questioned, and countries may seek to obtain their own nuclear weapons capabilities. In short, I leave you this morning with more questions than answers. Possibly the best summation is from Walt Kelly's cartoon character Pogo. We have met the enemy, and he is us. Thank you.